There was plague in Stratford-upon-Avon in April 1564, so the prospects for anyone to have a baby that would survive, which were never very good, were terrible. But John and Mary Shakespeare were lucky, and the world was lucky, because in this house, some 450 years ago or so, on the bedroom upstairs, a baby was born, christened William, and that baby became our playwright. This house behind me has been, at least since the 18th century, a pilgrimage site, probably the greatest, the most famous literary pilgrimage site in the Western world, and perhaps in the whole world, because thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of people come to this town to see where Shakespeare was born. This house is a substantial middle-class house. Shakespeare's father was the bailiff, that is to say the mayor, briefly, of Stratford. When Shakespeare was 5 years old, he served for a couple of years, as well as had other offices in the town. The house is the house of a burgher, a substantial middle-class citizen, not a grand aristocratic house, much to the disappointment of those who would have preferred Shakespeare to come from noble stock. But he came instead from this serious middle-class background. His father was a glover, specializing in tanning and the making of rather fancy gloves. He also had some business buying and selling land, and also, as we know, quietly loaning money at interest on the side, something that his son William also did, it seems, at several points in his life. These were people who were rooted in the life of the provinces in England, not the grand life of the capital or of the court, but of citizens, the kinds of citizens, in fact, that Shakespeare perhaps most tellingly invokes in his play, The Merry Wives of Windsor, or perhaps in Henry IV, Part 2. Shakespeare was very sensitive to that world of the citizenry of this part of the country, and has often very comical, delicious accounts of what that life was like. It also was a world that had access to the countryside. Just a few blocks away, as it would have been then, there were fields. And Shakespeare would have been able to walk out in those fields, not only been able to, but had to walk out in those fields and get to know them very well, and have developed the sensibility that we know from his plays that he had toward life in the countryside, toward the life of the countryside. So this is the world that our poet came from before he, dare I say, escaped from it as a young man to the place that drew so many ambitious people of his world, that is to say, to London. Stratford-upon-Avon is a modest provincial town, not very large in any of its dimensions, but quite close to this house is the school to which Shakespeare presumably attended. I say presumably because the records of the school do not survive from the 16th century, but it was almost certainly the case that William Shakespeare, the eldest son of one of the principal citizens of the town, was sent to the King's Grammar School, a free school open to all qualified students. The education would have been by our standards, largely literary education, an education in literary classics, and by classics I mean Latin classics. Quite early on, after mastering the rudiments of the English ABCs, Shakespeare and his fellow students would have been taught, if necessary, beaten into learning Latin, and would have, we know quite a bit about the curriculum in these schools, would have read many of the Roman classics, including many plays, because part of that curriculum was the reading of Roman comedies, the works of writers like Plautus, whom Shakespeare subsequently drew upon in his writing of his own plays, such as the Comedy of Errors. So the rudiments of Shakespeare's literary practice lie in what happened in the classroom in the 1570s in this town in Stratford-upon-Avon. We know next to nothing about Shakespeare's youth. Records haven't survived, and it didn't strike anyone as interesting at the time to keep the account of a provincial teenager in Stratford-upon-Avon. But we do know that in the early 1580s, he almost certainly began to walk the relatively short distance across the fields from Stratford-upon-Avon to nearby Shottery, where he evidently had met and become quite interested in an older girl named Anne Hathaway. Anne Hathaway's father had died and left her a cottage in Shottery, and she evidently was a woman of independent personality and means, modest means, to be sure. Anyway, Shakespeare visited her. How do we know that in the early 1580s, the 18-year-old William Shakespeare was making his way up to Shottery? Because in that year, he married Anne Hathaway, 26 years old. And Anne Hathaway, as we know from the christening records of the period, was already pregnant with what turned out to be their first daughter, Susanna, who was born some months later. They got married, evidently, in order to seal their relationship before the signs of Anne Hathaway's condition became apparent. In the following year, Anne Hathaway became pregnant again and gave birth to twins, Hamnet and Judith Shakespeare. And those were Shakespeare's three children, Susanna, the eldest daughter, and then Hamnet and Judith. Hamnet died at 11, and the two daughters, Susanna and Judith, outlasted Shakespeare himself, William Shakespeare himself. The daughter, Susanna, the eldest daughter, had herself a daughter, Elizabeth, Shakespeare's granddaughter, whom he would have met. And those were that was the core of the Shakespeare family. But after the twins were born, as far as we know, Anne Hathaway was not pregnant again. And indeed, Shakespeare lived for much of their married life away from his wife, Anne Hathaway Shakespeare, in London. Anne Hathaway Shakespeare outlived her husband and remained in the house that Shakespeare had bought for them toward the end of his career, New Place in Stratford. It was to his wife, Anne Hathaway Shakespeare, that famously, or perhaps notoriously, Shakespeare gave in his will what he calls their second best bed. Some people think that meant that the really nice bed that they slept in, keeping the best bed for visitors. I suspect that it was a less sentimental and complimentary gift than that, a peculiar kind of sour gesture on Shakespeare's part. In any case, this is open to question.